My name is Claire Bennett. If you ask my family what happened to Bennett Industrial Supply, they'll tell you I betrayed my own brother. If you ask my brother, he'll say I was jealous. Ungrateful. Power hungry. If you ask the employees, they'll hesitate before answering. And if my grandfather were still alive, he would just look at me quietly and say, "You did what had to be done." 6 months ago, my brother stood up in front of 27 members of our extended family and called me a parasite. He said it calmly. He said it confidently. And he believed every word. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I already controlled 51% of the company he claimed to have built. And by the end of that month, he wouldn't have access to a single corporate account. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand how my family works. In our house, being the firstborn meant you were the heir. My brother, Ethan Bennett, is 4 years older than me. From the time he could walk, my grandfather took him to the warehouse on Saturdays. He wore tiny steel-toe boots and carried a clipboard that was bigger than his torso. Everyone laughed and called him the future CEO. I was called the smart one, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it means supportive role. Bennett Industrial Supply was founded in 1987 in Columbus, Ohio. My grandfather started it with one rented truck and a 4,000-square-foot warehouse near the rail yard. Fasteners, electrical components, commercial hardware. Not glamorous, but essential. By the time I was 10, we had 80 employees. By the time I was 18, we had 3 distribution centers across Ohio and Kentucky. Ethan was on the warehouse floor learning logistics. I was at home teaching myself Excel, because the inventory numbers in our printed reports didn't match the physical counts. No one asked me to do that. I just hated inconsistencies. In high school, I built a crude forecasting model for a class project using our public revenue estimates. When I showed it to my dad, he chuckled. "You should work on Wall Street," he said. "Leave the real business to your brother." I didn't argue. I just kept learning. I left for the University of Chicago at 18. Finance and data analytics. Summers at consulting firms. Long hours. Brutal feedback. No one cared that my last name was Bennett. That was the first time I felt equal. When I came home at 25, Ethan had already been named Director of Operations. My dad was still CEO in title, but he was slowing down. Golfing more. Delegating more. Ethan looked the part. Tailored suits, confident handshake, easy smile. He could walk into a supplier negotiation and shave 5% off pricing just by making the other guy feel like they were old friends. Revenue had grown 40% in 3 years. Debt had grown 110%. I noticed that the first night I reviewed the financial statements, lines of credit had been expanded, equipment leases stacked on top of each other. A new distribution center in Louisville financed with variable rate debt. I asked Ethan why we chose floating interest instead of fixed. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Because we're scaling. Fixed rates limit flexibility. That flexibility could double our payments if rates move. They won't." That was his answer to everything risky. They won't. I was hired as Financial Strategy Manager. Translation: manage the spreadsheets and don't challenge your brother publicly. For a while, I played along. I renegotiated a supplier contract that was quietly draining margins. I restructured a warehouse lease Ethan had signed without catching the escalation clause. I refinanced one of the equipment loans under better terms. At family dinners, Ethan would raise his glass and say, "We optimized operations this quarter." I let him have it, because I believed the company mattered more than credit. My grandfather noticed. He stopped going to the office every day when he turned 82, but he still demanded quarterly reports. Instead of asking Ethan to bring them, he asked me. I'd sit at his kitchen table while he adjusted his reading glasses and went line by line. Why are receivables stretching past 90 days? Why is payroll rising faster than productivity? Who approved this expansion timeline? I answered honestly. He never interrupted. One afternoon, about a year before he died, he asked me something I've never forgotten. If the market contracts by 20%, who protects the company? Not who grows it. Not who inspires the team. Who protects it? I didn't answer immediately. "I would," I finally said. He nodded once, like that was the only answer he needed. I didn't know then that he had already made arrangements. When he passed away, the funeral filled an entire church in Columbus. Employees cried. Suppliers flew in. Ethan gave a speech about legacy and leadership. People applauded. A week later, we sat in a law office downtown for the reading of the will. Most of it was predictable. Personal assets divided evenly. Donations to a local trade school. The house left to my grandmother. Then, the attorney cleared his throat. Regarding Bennett Industrial Supply. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Expectant. 5 years ago, Mr. Bennett established a controlling trust. The word trust made my father frown. 51% of company shares were transferred into this trust structure. Ethan blinked. The designated controlling trustee is Claire Bennett. Silence. Ethan actually laughed. Okay. So she holds it symbolically? The attorney shook his head. No. Voting control and final authority over major financial decisions rests with her. I felt every pair of eyes in that room shift toward me. My father looked confused. Ethan looked irritated. I felt something heavier than power. Responsibility. That night, Ethan knocked on my door. You're not actually going to use that, right? He asked casually. Use what? Control. You're not built for leadership. You analyze. I lead. I held his gaze. I lead differently. He exhaled sharply. If you interfere, you'll fracture this family. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. For a year, I didn't use my authority. I watched. And what I saw scared me. Ethan acquired a small logistics startup without a full audit. He signed a major contract with a regional construction chain, offering 120-day payment terms to secure exclusivity. Revenue spiked. Cash flow tightened. Our primary bank flagged our leverage ratio. I recommended a third-party audit. He called it sabotage. Then came the dinner. 27 relatives. My aunt's lake house. Wine flowing. Laughter bouncing off the glass walls overlooking the water. Halfway through dessert, Ethan stood up. I need to address something, he said. His voice was calm. Controlled. For the past 6 months, Claire has been attempting to block strategic growth. She questions leadership in front of staff. She hides behind legal technicalities. People shifted uncomfortably. She's forgotten that this company exists because I've devoted my life to it. I felt heat rise in my chest. And now she's leveraging a trust document to threaten control. There it was. He was framing the narrative before I ever acted. She's being ungrateful, he finished. Grandpa would be disappointed. That's when something inside me went still. Not angry. Not hurt. Still. I stood up slowly. I requested one thing, I said evenly. A full debt exposure report. He smiled faintly. Exactly. No one asked what the numbers were. No one asked why I was concerned. The verdict had already been written. I sat back down, and I made my decision. I would not argue at a dinner table. I would act in a boardroom. The next morning at 8:03 a.m., I sent notice for an emergency shareholder meeting under my authority as controlling trustee. At 8:17, Ethan stormed into my office. You're actually doing this? Yes. You're going to humiliate me? I'm going to protect the company. You think you can run it? I didn't raise my voice. I already do. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and what the independent auditors uncovered in the next 10 days wasn't just aggressive expansion. It was exposure severe enough that if interest rates ticked up another point, we would violate our loan covenants, which meant the bank could call the debt, which meant everything my brother believed he owned could disappear overnight. He thought this was a sibling rivalry. He didn't realize it was a structural collapse waiting to happen. And he definitely didn't realize that I had already prepared the documents that would remove him from operational control. He would. Very soon. The auditors arrived on a Monday morning. Not flashy, not dramatic. Just 3 people in neutral suits carrying laptops and document request lists that were longer than most contracts Ethan had signed in the past year. I didn't announce it to the entire company. Only the executive team knew. Ethan called me the moment he saw them in the conference room. You brought outsiders into this? His voice was low, controlled. The kind of control that barely holds. Yes, you're undermining me in front of my own staff. I'm protecting the company in front of its staff. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. You love hiding behind that word. Protecting. Maybe I did, because someone had to. By Wednesday, the tone had shifted. The auditors weren't just reviewing high-level statements anymore. They were requesting individual contracts, vendor agreements, debt schedules, acquisition paperwork for the logistics startup Ethan had purchased the previous fall. That acquisition had bothered me from day one. It was a small freight brokerage in Indianapolis. Flashy growth numbers, strong client list, aggressive projections. Ethan had framed it as vertical integration. He liked saying that phrase. What he hadn't mentioned was that their largest client represented 42% of their revenue. Concentration risk that severe should have triggered alarms. Instead, he had signed a purchase agreement within 3 weeks of first contact. No full operational audit. No stress testing. Just confidence. On Thursday afternoon, one of the auditors, Mark Feldman, asked me a question in private. Did you know about the secondary personal guarantee? I felt my stomach tighten. What personal guarantee? He turned his laptop toward me. There it was. A clause buried in the acquisition financing documents. Ethan had personally guaranteed a portion of the debt used to acquire the brokerage, but not just personally. He had cross-defaulted it with Bennett Industrial Supply, meaning if the brokerage missed performance targets and defaulted, the liability could trigger clauses in our primary corporate credit facility. In plain English, one bad quarter from a fragile acquisition could drag down the entire company. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Was the board informed of this? Mark asked. No, I said quietly. It wasn't, because there had been no real board oversight, just Ethan moving fast. That night, I went home and opened the original trust documents my grandfather had signed. He hadn't just given me voting control. He had written a letter. It wasn't part of the legal paperwork. It was separate, handwritten, folded into the folder. I had read it once, the night of the will reading. I hadn't opened it since. Claire, leadership is not about being liked. It is about being steady when others are not. If you are reading this in a moment of doubt, remember, growth impresses people. Stability protects them. Do not confuse applause with security. I sat on my kitchen floor and read that line 3 times. Do not confuse applause with security. Ethan had built applause. I was staring at fragility. The preliminary audit findings were ready the following Tuesday. I requested that the emergency shareholder meeting be expanded to include senior management and our primary banking representative. When Ethan saw the revised attendee list, he lost the calm tone. You invited the bank? Yes. You're trying to stage a coup. No, I said. I'm staging transparency. You think you're some kind of hero? I didn't answer that, because I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone holding a structural beam in a building no one else realized was cracking. The meeting took place in our main conference room in Columbus. Long walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Company logo mounted on the wall behind the head chair, Ethan's chair. He sat in it that morning like nothing had changed. Confident. Relaxed. Even smiling, as people filtered in. Our CFO looked nervous. The operations director avoided eye contact with me entirely. The representative from First Midwest Bank arrived exactly on time. Neutral expression. Legal pad in hand. When everyone was seated, Ethan began. Before we dive into whatever Claire thinks is urgent, he said lightly, I want to emphasize that we've had our strongest revenue quarter in company history. He clicked the remote. A slide appeared on the screen. Revenue growth chart, trending upward. Applause. There it was. Applause. I waited until it faded. Thank you, Ethan, I said calmly. Now let's look at cash flow. I stood and walked to the screen. Slide 2. Operating cash flow. Negative for 2 consecutive quarters. Slide 3. Debt-to-equity ratio. At its highest level since 2008. Slide 4. Exposure summary. If interest rates increased, another 1.25%. Silence. Ethan leaned back, jaw tightening. You're fear-mongering, he said. That's worst-case modeling? Yes, I replied. That's what risk management is. I clicked again. Slide 5. Acquisition liability structure. Cross-default clause highlighted in red. The bank representative leaned forward. I was not aware of this cross-default linkage, he said slowly. Ethan's head snapped toward him. It's standard structuring. It's aggressive structuring, the banker corrected. I felt the room tilt. Not physically, psychologically. For the first time, doubt entered the air. I continued. If the Indianapolis brokerage loses its primary client or misses its projected EBITDA target by more than 15%, covenant violation risk increases to 70%. I let that sit. And if the covenant is violated? Our CFO asked quietly. The banker answered. We reserve the right to call the debt, which meant immediate repayment demand, which meant liquidity crisis, which meant collapse. Ethan stood up abruptly. This is theoretical. No, I said, keeping my voice level. It's mathematical. You've been waiting for this, he snapped. You've been building a case. I've been building a safeguard. He looked around the room, searching for support. This is what happens when you let analysts run companies, he said bitterly. They freeze growth. They choke momentum. I met his eyes. Momentum without margin is a cliff. That was the moment. The exact second when control shifted. Not because I was louder, but because the numbers were. The banker closed his notebook. Given these findings, he said carefully, we would recommend immediate corrective action and oversight adjustments. Oversight adjustments. Corporate language for change in leadership structure. Ethan stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You planned this, he said under his breath. No, I replied softly. You did. I reached into my folder and removed the final document. Under the authority granted to me as controlling trustee of 51% of Bennett Industrial Supply, I was formally restructuring executive oversight. Effective immediately. All debt-related decisions required trustee approval. Acquisition authority was suspended. Operational leadership would be overseen by an interim executive committee. And Ethan Bennett was relieved of unilateral decision-making power pending financial stabilization. I didn't remove his title. Not yet. But I removed his control. I slid the document across the table. His hand didn't touch it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the banker nodded once. This would satisfy our immediate concerns. Our CFO exhaled audibly. Ethan finally laughed, but there was no humor in it. You just embarrassed me in front of my own company. I held his gaze. You embarrassed yourself when you hid the risk. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later. People left quietly. No applause this time. Just silence. Ethan remained seated long after everyone else stood. When the room was nearly empty, he spoke without looking at me. You've always wanted this. No, I said. I've always wanted it to survive. He looked up then. And for the first time, he didn't look angry. He looked uncertain, which was far more dangerous. Because men like Ethan don't stay uncertain for long. They either learn or they retaliate. And 3 days later, I found out which one he had chosen. 3 days after the board meeting, Ethan stopped coming into the office. At first, no one said anything. His assistant claimed he was working remotely. Operations managers avoided eye contact with me in the hallway. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The company felt like it was holding its breath. Then, the rumors started. I heard them secondhand. Claire forced him out. Claire staged a takeover. Claire embarrassed her own brother in front of the bank. By Friday afternoon, I understood what Ethan was doing. He wasn't fighting in the boardroom. He was fighting in the narrative. The following Monday, I received an email from our HR director. Subject: staff concerns. Several senior warehouse managers had requested clarification about leadership stability. One even asked whether the company was being sold. That was Ethan's language. Sold. He knew exactly how to trigger fear. For decades, Bennett Industrial had been positioned as a family-run, stable employer. The idea of outside control terrified long-term employees. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I scheduled an all-hands meeting. Transparency works best in daylight. The warehouse floor smelled like metal and dust the morning of the meeting. 200 employees gathered between the loading bays. Some crossed their arms. Some avoided looking at me. Ethan stood in the back. He hadn't shaved. He didn't smile. I stepped onto the small platform we used for safety briefings. I know there have been rumors, I began. Silence. No one is selling this company. A few shoulders lowered. No one is shutting it down. More silence. But we are adjusting how we manage risk. I explained the debt exposure, not in abstract financial jargon, in practical terms. If interest rates rise, loan payments increase. If payments increase too fast, we lose flexibility. And when companies lose flexibility, people lose jobs. That word landed. Jobs. I will not allow that to happen, I continued. That's why oversight has changed. Someone raised a hand. Is Mr. Bennett still in charge? I didn't hesitate. Ethan is still part of leadership, but major financial decisions now require additional approval. There were murmurs, not angry, processing. Then, something unexpected happened. Tom Alvarez, warehouse supervisor for 23 years, stepped forward. We've survived recessions before, he said. As long as we're told the truth, we'll handle it. He looked at Ethan, then back at me. That moment mattered more than the board vote. Because trust doesn't live in conference rooms. It lives on concrete floors. The real blow came 2 weeks later. The Indianapolis brokerage, the one Ethan had acquired, lost its largest client. 42% of their revenue vanished in a single email. The client had been acquired by a national logistics chain. They were consolidating vendors. Exactly the concentration risk I had flagged. When the numbers came in, the impact was immediate. Projected EBITDA dropped by 26%. Covenant violation threshold, 15. We were officially in danger territory. The bank called within 48 hours. But this time, the conversation was different. Because corrective oversight had already been implemented. Because we had documented mitigation plans. Because exposure had been acknowledged before crisis hit. We negotiated an amendment instead of receiving a demand letter. Higher fees. Tighter reporting. But not collapse. Not liquidation. Not bankruptcy. When I hung up that call, my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From relief. We had come within inches of freefall. And no one at that lake house dinner had understood how close we already were. Ethan came to my office that evening. He closed the door behind him. No anger. No performance. Just exhaustion. You knew, he said quietly. I suspected. You were waiting. I was preparing. He walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot. I thought growth would fix everything, he admitted. I didn't answer immediately. Growth amplifies whatever foundation you build on, I said finally. If it's stable, you scale. If it's fragile, you accelerate collapse. He let out a long breath. They all think I'm reckless now. No, I said. They think you moved fast. That's the same thing. It doesn't have to be. He turned toward me. You could remove me. It wasn't a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. Legally, I could. The trust gave me that authority. The bank would support it. The board would sign. For a moment, I pictured it. Clean. Simple. Final. But that wasn't what my grandfather had built. He built resilience, not humiliation. I'm not removing you, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly, confused. But you're not running unchecked anymore. He gave a small, humorless smile. So I report to my little sister. You report to the structure that protects the company. Silence stretched between us. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, softly. I really thought you were just the smart one. I am, I replied. You just underestimated what that meant. For the first time in months, something shifted. Not dominance, not surrender. Reality. The restructuring took 90 days. We sold the struggling brokerage at a loss. Controlled, strategic, survivable. We reduced expansion plans. We converted variable debt to fixed where possible. Margin stabilized. Cash flow turned positive again. And something else changed too. Board meetings became collaborative instead of theatrical. Ethan still led operations. He was good at it. He motivated teams. He secured contracts. But now, every major commitment crossed my desk, not as a formality, as a partnership. The real closure came at another family dinner. Smaller this time. Immediate family only. My father raised a glass. To resilience, he said. He looked at me longer than usual. Ethan cleared his throat. I owe Claire an apology, he said. The room went quiet. I thought she was trying to limit us. She was trying to protect us. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. But it was public, and that mattered. After dinner, he stepped beside me on the porch. You didn't humiliate me, he said quietly. You stopped me before I humiliated myself. I studied his face. You're still the visionary, I told him. Just build on something solid. He nodded once. No rivalry. No applause. Just understanding. 6 months later, Bennett Industrial Supply reported its most stable year in a decade. Not the highest revenue. Not the flashiest growth. But the strongest balance sheet we'd ever had. Employees got bonuses. The bank upgraded our risk rating. And for the first time, when someone introduced Ethan as the future of the company, he corrected them. We run it together, he said. People like applause. But stability builds legacy. My grandfather knew that. Now my brother does too. And if protecting what you love makes you look like the villain for a while, it's a price worth paying.